The long-awaited continuation of the Resident Evil franchise is finally here. But is it worth the wait? In short, absolutely. Wait, don't leave because there's more to this review. I've played every mainline Resident Evil game and many of the side games. In order to understand Resident Evil Village, I'd like to discuss the series for a moment. In my mind, the series can be broken down into three distinct eras. Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, 0, and to some extent, Code Veronica fall into one era, the classic era, classic survival horror games. While there was action, it was kind of weak, and the survival horror aspects really took the center stage. It was more about avoiding a fight, completing puzzles, and navigating complex levels, rather than killing everything in sight. Resident Evil 4 was the game that shook up this formula. It still had survival horror elements, but the action was much tighter and made up a much greater percentage of the game. It's a great game, but it did veer pretty far from the roots of those classic games. 4, 5, and 6 make up what I consider that next era. 4 was amazing, but then 5 and 6 took the wrong lessons from that game and largely abandoned the survival horror elements. I feel like 6 nearly destroyed the series. Then, after a long interlude, Resident Evil 7 came out. I feel like this game, as different as it was from the previous games, using the first-person perspective and a single contained level for the entire game, helped bring together the horror elements from the earlier games with the action elements of the later games. And the remakes continued that evolution. Thus, Resident Evil 7, the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes, and Resident Evil Village, in my mind, make up the third modern era of Resident Evil. These games have a lot of action, and it's quite competent, but there's also a lot of tension and a real return to those horror roots. I feel like Resident Evil Village is the culmination of all these previous games into a package that really works for me. I'm not trying to diss any of those older games. They all have strengths, and I really enjoy them. Except for Resident Evil 6. Screw that game. But I really think Capcom has been on a roll lately, and I'm excited for where the series goes from here. First off, the game looks amazing. There are moments of both great beauty and great horror, and the engine really shines while keeping the performance acceptable. The ray tracing, while subtle, definitely adds to some of the locations. My only complaint is I found a few odd situations where the game looked a bit grainy or fuzzy. I believe it was an intentional film-style artifact, but I wish you could disable this effect, as it took me out of some scenes. There's also some occasional unexplainable performance issues. There were some particular rooms or areas that would instantly cut my FPS in half. And sometimes the game would just run really poorly until I restarted it. I believe there's a memory leak or some kind of memory issue in the game. The sound of music is quite good. The music is atmospheric and not particularly intrusive until you hit certain action scenes. The sound effects and voice acting are all top-notch. Ethan's voice acting is also quite good. He's constantly getting hurt, stabbed, maimed, and his voice acting and screams of pain are actually pretty realistic. The story and characters are also quite good, though with a large amount of classic Resident Evil camp. As much as I enjoyed the interesting villains, I wish more time was spent on the backstory and setup of some of these enemies. Lady D and her daughters, which the internet has become so enamored with, are gone quite early and without much detail on them. I personally ended up enjoying the Benevito estate and the Heisenberg factory areas more, which were barely spoiled prior to release. These areas are nearly complete opposites, with one being a psychological experience without any combat, and the other being nearly endless combat arenas, but both end up being quite memorable.
Hey, don't I get a say in this?
Silence! My decision is final. There will be no argument. Remember from whence you came.
Thank you.
Lycans and gentlemen, we thank you for waiting. And now let the games begin!
Let's see what you have. Ethan Winters.
Get ready.
No!
10, 9, 8.
Speaking of scares, this game has them in spades. Things jump out at you, there are moments when you're defenseless and running for your life, There's several sections where an opposing enemy like Mr. X is roaming around while you're trying to avoid certain death. Ethan is maimed, stabbed, tortured, and always feels one step away from death, almost to a comical degree. There are a couple of these moments where you're just running without much chance to fight back, and they want you to go a certain path, and sometimes that path is not always as obvious, and I died a couple of times to things that I don't think were clearly explained, but they were few and far between. That's not to say that you're always defenseless. The action is quite good, and the gunplay feels competent. Enemies will rush you, dodge from you, throw things at you. It feels better than the remakes, in that most enemies can often be downed with a single headshot, rather than dozens, and there's more of a reaction when you fire. The game has several interesting fights against larger enemies, or large groups of weaker enemies, and there's a surprising number of fights against enemies that require some interesting strategies to bring them down. There's also an included mercenary mode, which I found was fun, and I spent several hours going through it, and it really lets the combat shine, and adds to the 8 to 10 hour experience. Overall, I'm quite pleased with the game and highly recommend it. It subtly brings together elements from all three eras of the Resident Evil series, while paving a new pathway for the series. It's an amazing evolution for the series, and it makes me very curious to see what is to come for the Resident Evil franchise, especially with how this game ends. It's quite interesting to say the least. Now, if you enjoyed this review, I have a ton of other reviews, previews, retro and virtual reality content on the channel. If you would like to, please check it out, and if you enjoy it, consider subscribing. I would appreciate it. Thank you again for watching, and everyone have a great night.